The cypress trees along Bayou Saint-Amant held the dawn like breath, their moss-bearded branches lifting a pale hush over the cane fields. In that bluish hour before the bell, Zélie Baptiste wrapped her palms with strips of old linen, the way her mother had taught her for hard days, each turn a prayer she didn't say aloud. She could smell the bitter sugar of crushed cane and the iron damp of the levee, and beneath those familiar scents, the ghost of incense that always clung to the big house chapel, where her master kept his saints polished and his sins unconfessed. She tucked the last strip of linen, considered the scar that cut across her right thumb, and whispered in Congo and French at once, a braid of language as old as her body's memory. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you. Monsieur Donatien Leclerc rose with the bell, but never with work. Others worked his harvest and his pride. He worked his beads, fingers sliding over the rosary he wore like a badge. He liked to say the rhythm steadied him, that the Virgin's patience tempered a man's temper. Zélie had learned that men who spoke of tempering often meant they had none to spare. She had been purchased with her mother when she was 11 and small enough to hide behind a coil of rope. 12 years later, the rope had become the world's border. The boundaries of Leclerc's Marais Lavande plantation ran from the river road to a cracked stone milepost. And further than miles were the rules that nested like wasp combs. Don't meet a gaze too long. Don't leave a task unfinished. Don't sing unless the work gang sings. Don't speak Creole where French is demanded. Don't pray unless it's the way the master wants prayer to look. Leclerc believed in categories, black and white, sinner and absolved, owner and owned. And as long as the categories held, he slept well. He wore a rosary of dark olive wood with a crucifix that flashed when the sun struck it, and when he passed Zélie on the veranda, he'd sometimes raise it so the figure of Christ looked like a mirror to her face. "See?" he'd say softly, a priest's velvet in his voice. "All suffering can be holy if it makes you obedient." The first morning the river flood receded and left fish stranded in the ditches, Zélie made a vow. She didn't call it that even to herself. Vows, in the way she understood them, belonged to people who could sign their names, to priests and men who rode into town on horses that didn't flinch at gunfire. Hers was a river vow, a silent braiding of will with water. She would learn every hinge of this place, the pantry latch that stuck in summer, the key to the wine cabinet hidden in a hollowed-out catechism, the way the chapel door swelled in August so it needed an impatient shove of a shoulder to close. She would learn the weight of the rosary in Leclerc's hand by the sound of its beads clacking when he turned too quick. She would learn the map of his sleep. By the time the cane reached her shoulder that year, she knew which floorboards spoke and which held their tongues. She knew the footfall of every overseer, and she knew that the one called Masson drank before noon and told stories that turned him kind until they didn't. She knew the chapel's votive rack by heart. St. Joseph bent slightly forward as though listening. St. Michael raised a sword that caught dust motes like stars. The Virgin of Sorrows wore 7 knives in her heart and looked like a woman who endures because she must. Zélie placed her own invisible saints among them. Mami Wata with her river-cool hands, the women whose names she didn't know who had endured ships and sails and births in the dirt, the small fierce god of the indigo pots from her childhood who took dye-stained hands and turned them into flags. In the kitchen the air was always thick with what it took to keep white men's bodies content. Cream, lard, onions cut so fine the eyes watered and kept watering. Zélie moved through that heat like a measured breeze. She carried trays. She listened. She learned that men loved to talk in rooms they believed were theirs, and kitchens were the most boastful rooms of all. The sugar broker from New Orleans with a mole that sprouted 3-course hairs spoke of prices as if they were weather. A priest with a voice like sweet tea told a story about a woman in Pointe-Coupée who lost her faith and then her child, and how, he said, the order of those losses mattered. Leclerc laughed at that one, then crossed himself as if to patch his joy with ritual. "Faith first," he said, "then family. It is cleaner for a man's conscience that way." There was a pantry cooler than any other room, set back into the earth in the oldest part of the house. That pantry had a second door, hidden by barrels, that led to the small chapel where Leclerc liked to sometimes sit with his ledger and his beads. He said it kept his accounts righteous. Zélie noticed how his fingers quickened on the beads when numbers didn't add as he wanted them to, and how his breath evened out when they did. She kept noticing. Noticing was a way of keeping time, and time was the only currency she was allowed to spend freely. On a Sunday, when the sky held its rain like a secret, Masson dragged a boy named Etienne across the yard for stealing a heel of bread. Etienne's lips were chapped, and his eyes had that watery shine that meant fever, and Zélie knew the bread had saved him from shaking apart. She also knew how men liked to correct what hunger had dared. The lash cut the air in clean pieces. Etienne made a sound like a torn sheet, then made no sound at all. When it was over, Leclerc touched his beads and murmured an Ave as if a woman somewhere had been honored by his cruelty. That night, the chapel smelled heavier than usual, incense and red wine and wax. Zélie brought a basin to clean a spilled chalice. It was always her lot to erase the evidence of other people's faith. As she knelt, her head close to the floor, she felt rather than heard someone enter. The beads whispered against wood. She knew that sound the way a mother knows her child's breathing. She kept her eyes on the stain, on the way wine sank into grain, and then slowly rose again, an old trick of wood. Zélie, he said. He always said her name like it tasted good. There's a dignity in silence. Do you know it? I know work, mon maître, I answered without looking up. He took a step closer, and the crucifix caught her peripheral vision, a sudden gleam as if the figure on it had moved. I will have no murmuring. I will have no rebellion of the tongue. You keep the house neat as a nun. Remember that when your people forget their place. Oui.
He tilted her chin with 2 fingers, so she had to look at him. His eyes were the blue of glazed crockery. They showed nothing, but the eyes of the men who guarded him showed all the things he wanted done. You are clever, he said. A house stays steady when a clever woman minds its doors. He let her go and touched the beads, thumb finding the worn place on the Our Father medallion the way a man finds a rut in a familiar road. The gesture was affection, habit, arrogance, prayer. It didn't matter which. Zélie watched the rosary fall against his vest like a chain that had forgiven itself for being a chain. In the quarters that evening, Zélie found her mother, Adèle, sitting with a clay bowl of salt water in her lap. She dipped her fingers and made a cross on Zélie's forehead, then another in the air. Salt keeps out what wants to rot, she said. Not everything bad comes from outside. Some rotting starts in the heart when a man thinks he is God. Zélie had no good words to give back, so she gave work. She plaited her mother's hair with cotton thread she had plucked from fallen bowls. She set aside 2 threads, dyed indigo, with a pinch stolen from the dye house, and wove them in hidden near the scalp where only a careful hand would know. For the river, she whispered, and her mother smiled without teeth, the way women smile when a thing hurts too much to show to the world. The season turned the fields hard and then soft again. Storms marched up the river with drums in their bellies. One ripped the roof from the sugar house and scattered shingles like cards. Leclerc cursed the storm the way a man curses a gambler who refuses to play by the rules. We build, and the Lord provides if we ask him right. He upped the work gangs, lengthened hours, and then in a rare show of magnanimity, he gave each woman a tin crucifix to wear if she wished. Zélie took hers and slid it onto a string with 2 small cowrie shells she had kept since childhood. She wore it under her dress where the metal could learn the language of her skin. At night, she listened to the bass line of the river and thought about how the rosary in Leclerc's hands made prayer into an instrument. In other mouths, the rosary was comfort, a counting that soothed the brain into remembering mercy. In his, it was a metronome for power. He times himself, she told Adèle in a whisper as they shelled peas. He likes to know how long things take. He has patience with himself, but not with other people. Then we learn his timing, Adèle said, simple as a recipe. The plan that grew in Zélie's mind never called itself a plan. Naming such things was dangerous. Words had ways of walking where ears waited. Instead, she collected pieces: a strip of linen from a tattered bedsheet, a pin from the sewing basket that would hold when a knot might slip, a forgotten key stolen from beneath a missal, palm ash from a burned frond. She mixed the ash with a fingertip of lard and rubbed it into the linen to make it grip. She told herself she was making bandages. Bandages were a reasonable thing for a house girl to make. Bandages did not raise questions. Bandages could lie beside a rosary and look like kin. On the Feast of the Assumption, the white ladies came in hats that bloomed like gardens. The big house smelled like sugared almonds, starch, and powder. Zélie poured coffee, and the priest praised Leclerc's piety with words like pillars, stalwart, dean of the parish, example. In the small chapel after the party, the men left cigar smoke that climbed to the rafters and clung like a restless soul. Zélie opened windows and watched the smoke wobble, then break into pieces and slip out. She thought of Etienne's breath catching on the lash and drew a small cross on the floor with a damp brush. Water only, no salt. A water cross evaporates and still counts. She told herself that anything that passed through that doorway had to walk over a prayer that she had made. She told herself that prayers could be ropes if they were braided tight enough and long enough.
News moved like wind in cane. A rumor of an auction upriver. Talk that the war in Mexico would make sugar dear or cheap, depending on which mouth said it. Zélie heard of 2 women sold away from Belchane, and of a man shot at the ferry for running. She heard the priest say from the pulpit that obedience would be rewarded in heaven, and she heard her mother murmur in the night, "Heaven bends when the poor pull together." She collected these sounds and laid them beside the sound of beads sliding through fingers, beside the sound a linen strip makes when it tightens around another linen strip with the intention of not letting go. The first cold snap the year she turned 23 snapped something else. An infant born to a woman named Lolly breathed and then did not. Zélie held the tiny body as if warmth could be poured back like tea, and when she looked up, Leclerc was in the doorway of the quarters, rosary in hand, a look on his face like someone who has lost a coin and blames the floor. "God decides," he said, "not unkind, but not kindly either. It spares us from bad choices." He moved 2 beads with his thumb, and the beads sounded like rain trying to fall and being told to wait. Something in Zélie's chest set its jaw at that. Her mind did the counting she had trained it to do. Which door was behind her? Which way would the moonlight fall if the cloud moved? How far to the kitchen, where there were knives, but dull ones? She set the child down and bowed, because bows are a currency that buys minutes. He left, trailing prayer, and she went outside and pressed her forehead to the cypress and told the saints she had named that holiness required a child to die to keep a man's house steady, then holiness needed revising. That winter, the river dropped low and showed its bones. Men walked where boats had floated. Children found bottles, a rusted hinge, a chain wrapped twice around a stone. Zélie found a small medallion with the head of a woman with a veil, the Virgin no doubt, and pocketed it. She rubbed it until her thumb made a warmer shine on the left cheek. She told herself that if the Virgin lived in every small metal face men carried, then the Virgin could live in hers for a while too. "I will keep you until you learn my name," she said to the medallion. "Then I will give you back to whoever needs you next." During Epiphany, the priest preached about gifts. He liked that story because gifts could be turned into praise for those who owned the means of giving. Zélie thought of other gifts: a woman who could weave a basket that held water for an hour, a boy who could whistle the way a whip sounded so the men could practice not flinching, a girl who could steal a key without the key knowing it had been stolen. She used her gift,
attention, until it sharpened into a useful blade. Leclerc's routine fit inside the rosary's loop. Morning prayers until the Angelus, accounts by the chapel window where light fell like permission. He'd slide his thumb, Our Father, 10 Hail Marys, Glory be, and when certain numbers did not comfort him, he would stand, pace the small chapel, and rest his hand on the altar as if the stone itself could make a man solvent. He never locked the inner door when he paced. Men who believe the world is theirs forget to lock doors on their own ground. The afternoon, the steamboat Ibis exploded its boiler and sent a gray tower of scald into the sky. The household gathered on the levee to watch the panic. Men ran in shirt sleeves, train boys cried. Zelie stood with a basket at her hip and fixed the blast in her mind as a sign that even engines strain and break when they are overworked and overheated. She watched the way the scald hung, then fell, and thought how pressure has a sound just before it releases. It was the same sound she sometimes heard in herself when Leclerc's beads clicked too close to her ear. On the eve of St. Joseph, he came into the kitchen unexpectedly. Zelie was alone, arm deep in a sack of rice, measuring with her hands since weights were kept where women were not. He stood in the doorway, and the lamplight made him look carved. He twined the rosary round his knuckles so the crucifix lay across the back of his hand, the way men sometimes hold a pistol they don't plan to fire. "You run this house like a monastery," he said. "Do you know, Zelie, that if you were born to a different father, a convent would have called you?" "Maybe I was born to the river," she said, before she could swallow it back. His smile suggested a priest's patience and an overseer's ledger. "Rivers flood, mademoiselle. Walls keep order." He walked past her then, opened the pantry, lifted the catechism, and took the key she knew was there. He did not turn to see if she had seen. Men who keep sacred words as hiding places often assume the whole world believes the same map. He went to the chapel, and she heard the inner door thud. She put down the rice and wiped her hands on the linen she kept tied to her waist. It had ash in it. It had a purpose. She did not tell herself she was about to do a thing. The mind respects weather. Sometimes it simply notes a storm and walks into it because standing in the open is worse. She moved through the pantry, shifted the barrels, and pressed her palm against the seam where old wood met older brick. The door opened with a sigh, a sound like a book closing. Inside, the chapel kept the day's last light in bowls along the floor, the way low windows do when sun is a dwindling coin. Leclerc sat at the small desk with his ledger. He did not look up, trusting that the world would announce itself before it touched him. Zelie stepped so the floorboards chose not to speak. She watched his hand move beads as he moved sums, a litany of pleasure, profit, prayer, profit. Her mother once said a man could be 2 devotions at once if the second one fed the first. She stood behind him long enough to hear him whisper, "Our Father." He always lingered on, "Forgive us our trespasses," the way a thief lingers by a lit doorway. When he reached, "As we forgive those who trespass against us," he liked to slow, as if magnanimity needed savoring. Zelie timed her breath to his. She looked at the rosary looped from his right hand to the desk corner, dark olive wood beads. She knew the cross would be cool. She had handled crucifixes before, too many. They were always cool before warmth taught them the bodies they graced. "Mon maître," she said softly, almost kindly, as if the words could be a shawl. He didn't start, only turned his head a fraction, expecting coffee or a question. "The kitchen needs a new pot," she said. And when he nodded without really seeing her, she stepped close enough to smell his hair tonics and the starch in his collar, close enough for the linen at her waist to learn the pace of his breathing. "Write it down," he murmured. "Masson will sign." He returned to the ledger, thumb on bead, thumb on bead. Zelie reached, Not for the ledger, for the rosary. She lifted it from his right hand with hands whose work had taught them how to move heavy things without calling attention. He made a small protest. Eh? Not a warning, a confusion only, as if a fly had passed. She drew the loop behind his head and down, a gentle chain. The first touch of wood to his throat was the kind of touch that feels like someone adjusting a scarf. She could feel the beat there, a pulse the river would have recognized as kin. He began to rise. She did not pull, not yet. She leaned her weight into the line she had made, a gardener staking a young tree. Mon maître, she whispered again. And this time the words were a mercy she meant. I will make this quick, if you will let me. He put his hands up, not to fight, but to untangle a necklace that had misunderstood its job. His fingers met hers. For a second, all four hands held the same beads, the same prayer. Masson's voice sounded faint in the yard. A door somewhere opened and closed. Someone laughed, one of the hands whose laugh always ran ahead of his jokes. Zélie tightened the line. She did it as if tying an apron. She did it as if tucking a child into a blanket. She did it with the care of a woman who has spent her life making dangerous things look harmless until they were finished. His breath shocked the beads into clicking music, quick, uneven. He put his fingers beneath the rosary, trying to make space. Zélie moved her grip lower, crossing the line so the wood lay flat and firm. The crucifix pressed into the hollow at his throat, a cold star. He grabbed at the desk and knocked the ledger to the floor. Money made a sound as it fell, like rain that means to hurt. He made another sound then, not words, a plea the body speaks when it realizes its own borders are failing. She leaned. She had chosen a place where the floor did not cry out. She had chosen a time when most were in the yard. She had chosen a tool he loved because she wanted to know what made him safe was not safe anymore. His hands flapped like a fish learns the air and then forgets. He tried to pray. The habit was that old, but prayer needs breath.
"Forgive us our trespasses," she said for him, and with each word she pulled the world tighter around his throat. Something on the inner door rattled then. Not a knock, a testing. A key maybe, impatient with its holder. Zélie did not look. She learned at 11 that looking at a danger sometimes feeds it. She listened instead to the river of his breathing breaking on stone. She felt the moment when the current faltered. The chapel's small window caught a last wedge of sun and threw it down on the floor. Dust in the beam looked like stars choosing a side. Zélie kept the line steady, reverent. This was not a killing, she told herself, though of course it was. This was a correction in a math problem men had been miscounting for 200 years. Above her, St. Michael raised his sword as he always did, stone forever deciding to decide. The Virgin kept her knives. Zélie thought, we all keep what makes us. A voice on the far side of the hidden door said, Monsieur? Then, a little softer, Donatien? The key scraped again. The door would not give. Humility of old wood. She had wedged the barrels just enough. Leclerc's hand found her wrist. His thumb pressed the scar on her right thumb, the one from the cane knife long ago. For a half moment they held each other's names without saying them. She expected to feel hate then, hot and simple. She felt something else instead. Clarity, cool and exact. If mercy existed, it was in ending a thing that had called itself holy while killing children. She tightened until the beads no longer clicked. On the other side of the door, Masson cursed the barrels. He would go around, she knew, to the front of the chapel. He would come through the main aisle with his hand on his pistol and his mouth open to swallow whatever he saw. Zélie let the rosary go slack and caught the weight of Leclerc's head with the same hands she had used to catch canning jars and falling children, and hope when it stumbled. She lowered him as if to sleep. The crucifix lay on his chest like a verdict. She turned it a quarter turn so the figure faced the ceiling and not her. Footsteps on the veranda. A hinge complaining. The front chapel door would swing wide in 5, 4.
Zélie slid to the side of the desk, the linen still around her waist, the rosary still in her grip like a snake that had decided, for once, to do what a woman asked it to do. She did not run. Running is a language men understand. She simply moved into the corner where the shadows kept a little cupboard of night, the kind that even a lamp has to negotiate with before it can enter. The front door swung, as doors do. Masson's silhouette cut the aisle. He smelled of sweat and the sweet sour of spirits. "Monsieur?" he said again, but softer now, because the air itself had spoken to him. His eyes found the desk, the ledger, the body's particular stillness. He did not draw his pistol. Men blink when the world slips its leash. He blinked like a man trying to fix a far horizon that kept turning into water. Zélie kept her breath low and slow. She could feel her mother somewhere in the house like a candle you can't see but know is lit. She could feel the river pressed tight against its banks, listening. She could feel every floorboard she had catalogued waiting for her next step. "Saints preserve us," Masson whispered at last, and then louder, the way men make noise when they are afraid of their own ears. "Help! Help here!" Boots on the porch. Voices, the house leaning inward like gossip. Zélie counted the steps she would need to reach the pantry door. She counted the barrels she would have to shift later when bodies made a different kind of noise. She counted the prayers she hated but could use if she had to, words like tools. Masson moved toward the body, hand in hand before he remembered himself. He reached for the rosary and then thought better of it. He did not touch the crucifix. Some metal teaches men they are not as brave as they say. He looked around, eyes hunting for an enemy the room refused to offer. The pantry door seemed glimmered. One more heartbeat. 2. Zélie's fingers tightened on the linen at her waist. Her heel found the quietest board. She stepped.
This story took us a long time. If you like it, subscribe. Now, back to the story. Stepped. The cupboard of shadows swallowed the motion, and the room rearranged itself around Masson's breath. He bent to the body like a man bowing to a sudden storm, fingers hovering above the olive wood beads as if the wood might bite. His lips moved, no prayer came out. When men cannot find God in their mouths, they look for someone to blame with their hands. Voices thudded against the doorway. 2 field hands, Henri and Timo, stood trembling, eyes bouncing between the crucifix on the dead man's chest and the rosary slack like a snake that had eaten too much. Behind them, the housemaid, Fleur, pressed a sleeve to her nose. Wax, incense, spilled ledger ink, the rank sweetness of a body losing its fury, all of it braided the air. "Shut the door," Masson barked, then gentled his voice, remembering the walls had ears and sometimes mouths. "Henri, fetch the priest. Timo, run to the sheriff's house on the river road. Say there's been an accident. Say it soft." Henri bolted. Timo's knees failed him once, twice, then he caught the doorway and fled with the graceless speed of someone whose body outruns his mind. Fleur hovered. "Go," Masson said, softer, as if coaxing a child from a snake's path. "Bring cloths." "No, nothing. Just go." The chapel settled into a high, strange quiet, a quiet that was not peace, but the instant after lightning. Masson's eyes combed the corners. They slid over the cupboard of shadow where Zélie had nested herself into breath and bone. A gnat stitched the air. A wax drip ticked down the side of a candle, as if time had decided to be visible. The rosary on Leclerc's throat seemed to hum with the last heat of him. Zélie folded herself thinner. She could feel the river behind the levee, pressed tight by night, listening. She could feel her mother somewhere in the quarters counting, always counting, breaths, steps, the number of beans left in a jar. She could feel the hunger in the house now that the man who had fed it its own power lay still.
Masson reached for the beads and stopped. His hand hovered, then made a small circle in the air as if blessing a harvest. He forgave himself, and then he did touch, 2 fingers only, lifting the crucifix to see the mark beneath. The skin was purpled where wood had pressed mercy into a bruise. He hissed air between teeth and let the cross fall back like a judge replacing a gavel. Boots scuffed the veranda. The front door widened to accommodate Law. Sheriff Dupree entered with 2 deputies, and with him came the priest, Father Baptiste, hat in hand, lips white at the edges as if he had bitten them blunt. "Mon Dieu," Father said, a prayer small enough to fit in a thimble. Masson straightened, performed a bow that could be read as deference or as guilt made tidy. "Found him like this. Inner door was stuck. I came round." The sheriff had the eyes of a man who had looked at many endings and tried to make them fit a beginning. He took in the ledger on the floor, the rosary snug about the neck, the way the chair had skidded and left 2 pleading arcs in the dust. He took in Zélie's absence without knowing he had, because he had summoned her presence so often to pour coffee and carry towels that his mind, expecting her like furniture, twitched at her invisibility.
"Accident," he said, testing the word as if it were a bridge, and he wanted to be sure it would hold his weight. Masson's mouth opened and shut. He prayed himself too tight. The joke failed on delivery and fell dead at his feet. He tried again. "Someone had hands here." He peered at the line on the neck. "These beads don't climb all alone." Father Baptiste moved to the body, wary, the way a man approaches a dog that might yet remember its teeth. He brushed 2 fingers across the forehead and made a cross in the air where it would do the least harm. His gaze snagged on the rosary, slid off, returned. "Madame Leclerc," he began, and then remembered there was no such woman to call. The house had not been troubled with a wife. Wives ask questions beads cannot answer. "Who was last with him?" the sheriff asked. Masson's eyes flickered to the pantry, then to the floor, then back again. He shrugged like a garment he wanted to shed. "He comes here when numbers vex him. House girl keeps this neat. Zélie. But she—" He paused, tasting a sudden fear like metal. He had never said her name in front of Law with anything but praise for order. The shape of it now felt like a betrayal. "Fetch her," the sheriff said to a deputy, and the deputy turned on his heel. Masson took a half step, not sure whether to block or bless. Zélie, in her cupboard of shadow, felt her own name pass by her, like a ghost looking for a body to haunt. She let it go. Names are tools. Sometimes you put them down, can pick up silence instead. She pressed her palm to the wall, found the seam she had learned with her eyes shut, and slid backward into the pantry's brick-cool dark while the men gathered their questions like guns. The pantry swallowed her, then gave her back to itself. Barrels, the forgotten catechism, the smell of onions dried down to sweetness, and on the floor the bit of ash she had used to teach the linen to grip. She breathed once, low, careful, and moved through the door that had opened for her before. In the kitchen, Fleur stood with a cloth in her hands she did not know what to do with. Zélie took it. "Put water to boil," she said, voice steady as the lip of a bowl. "If they ask, say you were sent." Fleur's eyes whitened, understanding the game without being told its rules. "Where you going?" she whispered. "Down," Zélie said, meaning the trap beneath the ashbox that led to the kraal where rats kept their parliaments. Then out. She did not say the river. She did not need to. The river had always been the answer wrapped in the question. She slid the ashbox aside, lifted the loose board, and let the earth's mouth take her weight. The dark beneath the kitchen was close and damp, like a secret that had learned to breathe shallow. She crawled forward on her elbows, linen biting her waist, beads still warm in her hands because the body that had heated them still sizzled in the chapel air. Above, footsteps measured authority. The sheriff's deputy barked Zélie's name into rooms that offered dust and the smell of starch in answer.
"Zili," he tried again, making the syllables ugly. The house, which had always known her better than the men who commanded it, held her absence like an egg, fragile, determined. The crawl spat her into the narrow space between kitchen and smokehouse. She crouched in the rectangle of evening. The yard had filled with bodies arranged by fear, hands near the back fence, eyes big, children tucked beneath skirts, Masson on the veranda with the priest and the law. The river's voice, which in daylight hummed low, now rolled its consonants like an impending sermon. She ran. Not fast. Fast hands the world by the throat and shakes it. She moved like a woman carrying a pot too full, careful, steady, letting corners do their favorite thing, forget what they have seen. She passed the wash shed, the fig tree, the line where a blue dress sagged like a horizon. She reached the back gate and found it chained and notched with a prayer cut into the wood, likely Father Baptiste's doing, a superstition pinned to a lock. She laid the rosary against the notch, as if paying a toll, slid the chain free, and stepped into the Cain's whisper. Cain sings different at night. It sings of hands and knives, and of green that wants to be fire. Zili knew the rows by their voices. She took the one that led to the old levee breach, now grown back with willow and the brittle bones of a collapsed fence. She walked low. Her feet knew the soft places, her mind knew the hard. Behind her, the yard filled with shouting. Ahead, the river shifted like a sleeping animal choosing another dream. She reached the breach and slid down the loose earth to the slick underbelly where frogs had written their promises in mud. The willow dipped. She crouched beneath its curtain and let it comb her hair. The rosary lay in her palm like a thing deciding what to be next. She considered leaving it for the river. Rivers keep secrets poorly. They also deliver messages the way storms deliver news. She tucked the beads into her bodice instead. Some messages must be hand-delivered. A shake moved in the willow shade. She didn't start. It was Henry, breath-tearing, eyes white at the rims. "Sheriff's lookin'," he said, voice gone thin. "Masson says he don't know. Father says devil did it. Devil don't use beads." He swallowed. "Z, where you going?" "To tell the truth to someone who can use it, and to keep the rest safe." He nodded, understanding anchored by love. He had always watched her cross rooms as if measuring a bridge. "You ain't alone," he said. "Etienne's aunt got kin upriver. They know the side bayous. I can fetch—" "No fetching," she said. "One voice walks quieter than a chorus." She squeezed his arm. "Tell my mother I left the pot on low. She'll know what I mean." He almost smiled. "She always do." She slid along the breach, then down to where the bayou unzipped from the river like a secret pocket. Cypress knees jutted like broken harp teeth. The night smelled of damp rope and turtle shells. A skiff waited where skiffs always seem to wait when a story has decided to keep going. She loosed it and set the oar. Water is a patient road when you move with it. Behind her, bell metal hit air. Father Baptiste rang his little handbell the way men ring the sky when they have no other tools left. Zili rode. The beads in her bodice tapped her sternum as if asking to be counted. She refused them the courtesy. Counting lives helps law. Silence helps the living. She aimed for a watchlight upriver where the Mare Lavan's nearest neighbor, Belle Hilare, kept a landing for sugar barrels in priestly visits. In her mind, she rehearsed the words she would need. Not confession, instruction. A woman with a chain had taught a man what the chain wanted that day. Now she would teach a woman with keys how to hide them where men never think to look. The skiff lipped the landing and bumped it with the soft knock of a kind visitor. Zili tied off and climbed. A dog lifted its head on the gallery above and decided not to waste its bark. The door opened before she reached it. A woman stood there with her hair braided into a crown like a problem solved. Madame Desmarais wore a robe and the face of someone who reads ledgers like novels and novels like recipes. "Child," she said without surprise, which surprised Zélie more than surprise would have. "You look like something that has done what it had to do." "Madame," Zélie said, and out of habit almost bowed. She did not. The river swelled somewhere behind her. "I need a room with walls that listen and don't talk back." Madame Desmarais glanced over Zélie's shoulder as if checking whether the night had followed. "Come," she said, and turned, trusting Zélie to choose whether to follow. Trust, offered like fresh bread, breaks some hungers. The room was small and lined with books that had learned obedience to shelves. The window wore shutters painted the serious green rich people choose when they are playing at humility. Zélie stood and felt her skin unwrap from the night. She took the rosary from her bodice and set it on the table between them. Madame Desmarais' eyes flicked down. She did not touch the beads. "I knew a girl once," she said slowly, "who brought me a knife wrapped in cloth and asked me to hide the cloth, not the blade. I asked why. She said, 'Men look for knives. They don't look for laundry.' She looked up. 'Tell me what I must hide.'" Zélie spoke. She did not confess. She did not justify. She arranged the facts like jars on a pantry shelf and labeled them with verbs that did not blush: took, turned, tightened, lowered, left. She named Masson, the sheriff, Father Baptiste, Henry, Fleur, the door seam, the quiet floorboard, the river road. When she finished, the rosary lay between them quietly, having run out of prayers. Madame Desmarais breathed through her nose, long and steady, the way women do when pain is a guest who has overstayed but remains under the roof. "Do you want the law, or do you want the truth to outlive the law?" "I want my people to live, and I want the men who kept those beads like a key to learn they keep nothing that is not given." Madame nodded, relieved to be given a problem with a solvable shape. "Then we write a new catechism. We use his saints against his sins." By dawn, a plan existed that refused to call itself plot, because women who must live under men's stories prefer plans that can pass as routine. The plan had chapters. Chapter 1 placed Zélie in the small cabin behind Belle Hilaire's wash house, where the smell of lye discouraged visitors. There she would become invisible long enough to choose which way to reappear. Chapter 2 sent a message downriver by a boy in a feed cap. Tell Adele the blue thread worked, so that Zélie's mother would know the river had taken her child forward, not away. Chapter 3 began the quiet circulation of certain objects among certain hands. Spare keys shifted to new hooks. Ledger pages copied by a careful girl who could trace a signature so closely the man who wrote it would recognize his own sins and not suspect hers.
Madame wrote letters as if sharpening knives. To Sheriff Dupré, we grieve. To Father Baptiste, we will host the vigil. To Masson, send a list of the household's needs. I will advise. Each letter slipped a question into a pocket where the intended reader would not feel it until too late. She sealed them with a little wax and a lot of certainty. Zélie slept sitting upright for an hour with her back against the wash-house wall and woke to the washwomen's chatter rising like steam. They spoke of nothing: bread, weather, a child who had finally cut a tooth, and in their nothing was the safety of a library. When the bell at Marais-Lavon tolled, it sounded flat, as if the iron understood it had rung for the wrong man all its life and now wanted to apologize. By mid-morning, the river road carried carriages and hungry eyes to Leclerc's vigil. Madame Desmarais dressed Zélie in a servant's plain, the sort of plain that men look through and women recognize as armor. "You'll walk with me," Madame said. "Walk like a shadow that knows its light." The chapel had been tidied. Fleur's careful hands had scrubbed ledger ink from wood grain and wiped away the last trace of a man's panic. Father Baptiste had placed white cloth over the desk, and Cup lifted the rosary from the dead man's chest to lay it threaded through the crucifix like a garland that had lost its mind.
The air was heavy with incense. Men burn when they wish to anesthetize memory. Faces filled the pews, planters who loved their sums more than their sons, wives whose mouths had learned to fold around disagreeable truths, poor whites brought in to serve as audience and threat both, enslaved people standing along the walls, quiet as windows. Sheriff Dupre sat near the front with a look that said he had already chosen a story and was just waiting for the rest to catch up to him. Masson stood at the back, hat twisting in his hands like a bird whose neck had not yet realized it was broken. Madame moved through the nave with a gracious gravity, nodding, placing a hand here, a word there. Zélie matched her pace. When they reached the front, Madame paused, the way a dancer marks a beat before a turn. She looked at the Rosary. She made the sign of the cross, something real under a scaffold built for show. Then she turned and spoke. Not loud, not soft, just a voice that had been obeyed for so long it did not shout unless thunder would be improved by company. Friends, she said, and that was a choice, that word. Monsieur Leclerc has been received into the hands of a God who measures differently than we do. The sheriff is a good man with a hard job. He will seek cause. I will seek consequence. Cause tells us what happened. Consequence tells us what must not happen again. She let the words settle like seed. In this parish, we have used beads to count prayers and prophets both. Perhaps we should decide which. A murmur went through the room. Father Baptiste stiffened like starch. Sheriff Dupre's glance sharpened. But the wives... the wives leaned forward as if, finally, someone had set a dish on the table that was not spoiled by pride. After the vigil, Madame and Father kissed cheeks with the polite accuracy of opponents who still intend to love the same children later. The sheriff cornered Masson and pressed him the way men press clay to see where it yields. Zélie stood with a tray and collected cups and knowledge alike. She heard a name threaded into sentences, Zélie, Zélie, where is she? And filed it away like a knife she would not pick up now. At dusk, the house of mourning remembered it had been a house of power. Men who had kept their hats off for an hour put them back on and felt brave again. They spoke in corners where they imagined God took naps. Runaway, one said. Jealousy, another. Witchcraft, the priest murmured, not for doctrine but for dread, and then corrected himself for show. Madame Desmarais requisitioned Masson, as if he were a barrel and she the ledger. You are foreman now, she told him, in a voice that made foreman sound temporary. You will run the place until heirs are named. You will keep the quarters quiet. You will find Zélie without breaking any more of God's commandments than you already have. Masson stared at the toes of his boots, like a man expecting scripture to appear there. If she's gone to the river, then she is smarter than you, which I already knew. She slipped a small parcel into his hand, wrapped in plain linen. Take this to Adele. Tell her I said the blue thread worked. He nodded, confused by errands that did not ask him to hurt anyone. He left with the parcel and a name he would not put in a sheriff's ear. Night stretched the yard long and thin. Zélie stood under the gallery rail and watched moths batter themselves at light the way certain men batter themselves at God. She felt a weight at her side. Madame had come to stand shoulder close, the way women do when the world requires a wall and two bodies will do. I will not hide you forever, Madame said. Hiding is as tiring as running, and the day comes when a woman wants sky.
I don't want forever, Zélie said. I want the days between now and the day I choose myself. Choose where? Madame asked, curious clean as a child's question. The river knows, Zélie said. But before that, she swallowed. The beads pressed a bruise against her sternum, a memory of the man she had unmade. Before that, I want to teach a lesson to a boy who thinks God is a fence. They found him at noon the next day on the levee where boys go to throw rocks at things that cannot be hurt by rocks. Etienne stood nearby, pretending not to watch him. The boy's name was Luc Leclerc, son of a cousin, heir presumptive by gossip's law, 14 and already repeating catechism answers as if they were decisions. He had eyes that had not yet learned to see that other people were not furniture. Madame approached openly, Zélie angled behind a live oak. "Luc," Madame called, "walk with me." He rolled a stone under his heel, thinking whether obedience or insolence would buy him more of what he wanted. He chose obedience, because boys do love the feeling of being righteous. "Yes, tante." He sauntered down the levee slope and into the shadow where Madame waited with a woman the boy had been taught not to see. Madame said nothing about deaths or rosaries or accidents. She said, "Luc, do you know how to listen?" He laughed. "Horses?" "People," she said flat. "They will own you if you don't." She turned to Zélie. "Speak." Zélie stepped into the boy's shade and watched his eyes try to decide whether to focus. She spoke softly, the way river water speaks when it is not trying to drown anyone. She told him none of the things men expected. She told him about floorboards that sing and ones that don't, about keys too high for most hands and the chairs women stand on to reach them, about the time it takes to boil beans and how the long simmer saves wood. She told him that God might be the name men give to the part of the world that refuses to be just theirs. She told him that every door has two sides. Luc's mouth made a small O as if to cradle a thought. "What does that have to do with—" he began, and then the shape of the word master formed and died in his mouth, because the woman standing before him had not asked for his permission to speak. Madame smiled, an expression both kind and fatal. "You will inherit a house if we let you. Houses fall on men who think doors open by themselves." She put a hand on Luc's shoulder and turned him toward the river. "Listen," she commanded. At first he heard only the easy noises, wind, a boat creaking. Then, because two women had decided he would, he heard more. The deep, patient thrum under everything, like a song cows understand. He heard the little slap of wave on plank and the far call of a man laughing wrong. He heard someone weep, quiet, behind a wash-house. He did not know it was Adele. He knew only that sound entered him without his leave and made a room for itself. He stood like that too long for a boy. When he finally looked back, Zélie was already walking away, her head high, meaning he had not been given the grace of seeing the person who had changed him, and that this was a kind of mercy. He could not put gratitude where the world would weaponize it. Madame caught up to Zélie at the path bend. "Are you satisfied?" she asked. "No," Zélie said, and almost smiled, but started. The parish awoke to a new map without noticing the roads had moved. Men locked doors they had not locked before and congratulated themselves on diligence. Women moved keys to places that understood loyalty. Sheriff Dupree asked questions that proved what he already believed and closed his case around the shape of a woman he could not find, like a hand closing around smoke. Father Baptiste preached a sermon that had more fear than mercy in it, and wondered, alone afterward, whether the Virgin's knives had points he had never noticed. At night Zélie wrote, not letters for law, but instructions for living the day after a door breaks. She wrote them in a hand steady as measuring flour. If he prays with beads, count what he fears. If the floor sings, change the song. If he tells you God is a fence, teach the fence to open from your side. She gave these pages to Madame, who read them as if tasting a new spice, and then sent them along paths women had been walking unremarked for 200 years. Rumor did its work in the quarters. Old men told stories they had kept behind their teeth until now, of ships and salt and captains who feared songs more than knives. In the big houses, accounts were quietly corrected, so that a woman who had never before signed her name on a ledger now signed and discovered she could. In the middle places, stables, dairies, and smokehouses, the small governments women make began to speak to one another openly, comparing laws. Masson, having delivered Madame's parcel to Adele, found himself gently refused by his own habits. He reached for a flask and his hand stopped at air.
He went to strike a man for spilling lye and found the room had learned to reorganize around softness and would not fit him if he forced it. He woke one morning to discover he had taken to polishing the candlesticks with a care that looked like a lot of penance. On a hot Tuesday with a sky the color of tin, Sheriff Dupre finally found Zelly because a woman decided he should. She was hanging sheets behind Bel Air, a clothespin between her teeth, expression quiet as water in a bucket. The sheriff approached like a man climbing into a confession he does not intend to tell. He took off his hat, because even men who do not know what they are looking at remember how their mothers taught them to greet a room. "Miss Zelly," he said. She looked at him as if at weather. He turned the hat in his hands and discovered all the words in it were for men. "You know why I came." She nodded as if counting. "You came to make the story sit still long enough to write it down to your size." He winced, not for insult, but because the truth sometimes pinches a man who has not worn it before. "I came to ask if you will speak." She hung another sheet. The wind bellied it toward him, then away, a white lung breathing between them. "If I speak," she said, "will the men who hear me learn to keep their hands off children? Will beads stop being used as bridles for other people's throats? Will the river break ranks and run backward?" "No," he said, and felt, for the first time in years, the relief of an answer that did not lie. She considered him. "I have done the thing the world says I must." She pointed with her chin at the sheets, the washpot, the pegged line. "You see, everything keeps moving." He swallowed. "There will be a trial if I take you." She met his eyes finally, and he saw there not fear but a mirror, his face, small and trying. "There will be a trial whether or not you take me," she said, "in rooms you don't control, with juries who do not ask your leave." She unpinned the last sheet as if to underline her point. "There already is." He put the hat back on, because men put hats on when their eyes get wet. "If you were mine to protect," he said low, "I would turn my back right now." "I am not yours," she said, and let him have the mercy of a smile with it, so the truth did not cut him to the bone. "But you can turn your back." He did. He walked away with steps that could be heard from the gallery, and when Madame Desmarais asked from the doorway, "Well?" he said, "I didn't find what I was looking for," and felt, to his own surprise, like a better man than he had been an hour earlier. The parish learned to live with a story it could not cage. It wore the tail like a hair shirt under its Sunday best. Scratch, scratch. In town, boys stopped twining rosaries round their knuckles to look mean. In kitchens, women wrapped knives in cloth and taught their daughters how to reach the top shelf with a chair that didn't wobble. In the quarters, someone carved a small cross into the underside of a windowsill and whispered for the water to find its way. In the rectory, Father Baptiste removed one knife from the Virgin's heart and hid it in a drawer, ashamed of his own superstition, but unwilling to give the knife back. As for Zelly, she chose. The river took her, not as a thief takes, but as a midwife does, catching. She went upriver first, to the kin Henry had mentioned. She taught what she had written. She showed how to walk through a house like you own the floor. She gave Madame's letters to women who folded them into apron pockets as if folding back their own breath, save for later. She went down river later, to the city that eats names and spits out other ones. She worked a laundry where the water ran red on Fridays because a butcher shared the drain. She carried a basket with the careful pride of someone with maps in her head. One night, years after the day the beads learned who they belonged to, she stood on a balcony that did not belong to a big house and watched carnival lift masks into air like prayers that had remembered how to laugh. Music from a distant square bent around a corner and found her ear. A young man leaned on the rail 2 doors down and flirted with the moon. He had the look of someone who had not been taught to count what counts. She smiled to herself and sent up a small request to any saint willing to receive it. Teach him to listen. She did not expect an answer. She had learned to be her own answer. Still, from somewhere, a church, a dock, a kitchen, bells stitched the night together. Not handbells rung like panic. The big bells that tell a city where it is in the story.
A knock. She turned. Henri stood in the frame as if he had asked permission of the wood, and the wood had said yes. Time had braided him into a man who stood level with most storms. "Adele sent me," he said, and the word mother arrived in her chest with both grief and bread. "She got a cough that don't care who she is. She says, come if you can. She says, bring the blue thread." Zélie packed in a minute and a lifetime. She tucked the rosary into a small bag where it lived next to a spool of dyed cotton and a slip of paper on which she had written the words she would need later. 2 doors, 1 world. She followed Henri down to the river because, of course, the skiff smelled the way it always had, wood remembering water. They rowed in a silence that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with speed. At Marie Lavande, the cane fields had traded whispers for rustles. The big house had a new paint, the kind of white that insists. Masson met them on the path, hat in hand. He had a scar now along his jaw where an old story had tried to keep its place. "She's waiting," he said, and did not attempt the rest of the sentences. Grieving men say what a strong woman is nearing the end of her strengths. Adele lay in a room that had learned to make space for breathing. She wore her hair loose, the way girls do, and her eyes were fever-bright in a way that made the world honest. She saw Zélie and laughed without sound. "Always did come when I lit you with your name," she said. Zélie knelt and threaded her mother's fingers with the blue thread. The thread worked. You taught it to. They sat like that while the room tried to choose morning or evening from the light. Adele spoke of small things, recipes, a story about a runaway pig that had ended at the river with laughter, a girl who had learned to mend porcelain by boiling milk and flour into a paste so strong it made a lie of breakage. She spoke of a boy who had learned to listen on a levee. She spoke of Masson astonishingly, and said, "A man can change his keys without changing his locks. Takes time. Takes a woman handing him the keys and not calling it mercy." When breath became work, Zélie began the prayer that lives in more languages than the church claims. "Thank you for this face. Thank you for these hands that taught mine. Thank you for the river that took what it had to and left what it could." Adele's last exhale left the room like a sheet pulled gently from a line. It fluttered once, twice, then lay across the bed, smoothing itself. The funeral pulled the parish's edges in. Women who had carried Zélie as a child carried pots. Men who had been cruel without noticing found their mouths full of softness. Father Baptiste, careful, brave in a way that looks like smaller things, came to the quarters and said words over Adele that were as plain as rice and twice as nourishing. The Virgin kept her 6 knives in the sanctuary. The 7th lay on Adele's grave, not to pierce, but to remember. After, at the back porch, Sheriff Dupré stood awkwardly, near the punch, hat off. "I still don't know," he said in a voice that had learned to be small when the world deserved it, "what story to write in my book about your master." Zélie looked out at the cane. It moved like a gathered dress in wind. "Then don't write that story. Write the one where women moved keys. Write the one where boys learned to listen. Write the one where a man of law turned his back and discovered his heart facing forward." He barked a laugh that embarrassed him, and then let it be. "I can do that. I can tell that one to my daughter." "Good," she said. "Teach her where the quiet floorboards are."
In the years that came like a string of beads, people told the tale of Donatien Leclerc in as many ways as there were mouths. Some said the devil himself had prayed too hard and tangled a holy rope. Some said a man killed himself by suffocating on his own sin, which is not how the body works, but is exactly how a story does. Some said a woman named Zélie walked through a house like a surgeon through a war hospital and performed the operation the parish needed. Those were the ones who had learned to count what counts. Zélie did not need the tale to be told right to live right. She moved to a small place upriver where the levee wore hibiscus, and a woman of means named Desmarais kept a room dusted with fevers she refused to catch. She taught laundresses how to read grain in wood, and men how to lay kindling so it remembered to light instead of smoke. Once, Luke came to her with a boy at his side, and a question so sharp it made him bleed a little to ask. How do I keep from becoming what I was trained to be? She handed him a broom. Sweep other people's thresholds, she said, once a week, until you stop counting it as penance and start counting it as pleasure. He did, and in the doing found bones in himself he preferred. On a spring evening when frogs had organized themselves into a choir with opinions, Zélie took the rosary from its bag and hung it over a nail in her kitchen. Not as a relic, as a reminder. Beads count what you tell them to. She tied the blue thread beside it. Above both, she tacked a scrap of paper on which she had copied, in her steady flower hand, a sentence that had walked with her since the day she stepped. The door opens from our side now. She put water on to boil. The pot cut a reflection of her face and made it a little rounder, a little kinder, as reflections do when the water has decided you've earned it. Someone knocked at the door. She went to answer, hands smelling of lemon rind and lye, heart steady as a river and flood that has learned its banks by heart. The knock came again, urgent, joyful. She opened. Henri stood there, hair wild with good news. Behind him, children she did not yet know leaned like question marks toward a sentence. "Stories," he said, grinning, breathless. "They're asking for stories." He gestured at the children. "They want the one about the woman who taught a rosary to obey a different God." Zélie laughed, the kind of laugh that repairs chairs. "That one's too long for before supper," she said, "but we can begin." She ushered them in, and the room widened to receive them because it could. She set out bowls, spoons, truth. The river outside said its piece to the bank, and the bank answered. Somewhere far off, a bell chose kindness over alarm and rang accordingly. Zélie began. "Before we start," she told the children and herself and the women listening through the shutters, "tell me where you're from. Tell me what your hands know how to do, then I'll tell you what mine learned." She picked up the blue thread. She touched the beads. She told the story in a voice that made the room write it down without paper. And because the world insists on cliff edges, even in places that have learned to build bridges, the knock that came after night settled was not Henri or a child or a neighbor with sugar to borrow. It was a stranger's knock, carrying distance and dust. Zélie opened to find a woman she had never met holding a letter sealed with a kind of wax she recognized, the kind that closes promises and opens doors. "For you," the woman said, and her eyes said, "Hurry." She broke the seal. Inside was a name that pulled breath from her body and set it running. The name of a girl she had known only as a whisper, taken down river years ago like a crate. The letter said the girl had found her way to the city and now was caught in a snare made of paperwork and priestly scorn. The letter said, "Come. We have a key, but need the hand that knows where to put it." Zélie looked past the woman to the night, which had abruptly recalled it was a road. She felt the river notice her and lift its face. She turned to Henri, to the children, to the beads and the thread. "Keep the pot on low," she told the room that was her life. "I'll be back with a story that needs telling." She took down the rosary, tied the blue thread so it ran along the beads like a vein, and stepped into the dark that had never again been empty.